I have come to appreciate a great deal about the traditional view towards Manoomin, and when you do start thinking about as an entity of its own right, then it changes the way you look at things. And instead of a plant depicting something, you start to think of it as telling us something.
Those pieces of rice have all seen so many different things throughout their own life stages, and so eventually what you have is generations of Manoomin that have been in those waters, and it's as if there's an entire community of people living within those waters. And you think about Manoomin from the plant starts coming up out of the sediment to eventually coming on somebody's table and being used in those feasts.
Band members and people who like to eat wild rice, they value it for that reason. Well, then you have your different crowd, your duck hunters. If you got rice, you've got ducks, and they could care less about eating it, but boy, they know it pulls the ducks in, and maybe fishing habitat, shoreline stabilization with the wild rice, and things of that nature. People value it for different reasons too.
Natural wild rice is highly sensitive to a multitude of environmental stressors. This includes fragmented habitats and high water levels, and it includes warming temperatures, interestingly, warming winter temperatures. Wild rice is vulnerable to different invasive and competitive species, and it's highly sensitive to water contaminants, such as sulfate, when it transforms into the toxic form of sulfide. And all this has led to the near decimation of wild rice in Michigan, as well as the impairment of many wild rice lakes and streams across Minnesota and Wisconsin.
Back in the day, probably 20 years ago, wild rice was visible based on aerial surveys. Right now, it's very, very sparse.
Located northeastern Minnesota, it's about 1,900 acres, so large lake, no real development around it, and it was really the gem of harvesting in northeastern Minnesota. Long history of cultural ties to the band, especially the Boys Fort Reservation, archaeological evidence on shore. Now it's pretty much been lost for the last 13, 14 years.
Manoomin regrows from new seeds every year. The seeds fall from mature Manoomin plants at the end of the summer into the lake bed to wait for a chance to grow. They may even lie dormant for years, waiting for favorable conditions. Together on this project, we are learning about these conditions, both in the ecological and social environment. And also, we are learning what conditions are favorable for our own collaboration.
A true collaboration takes much more than just securing that letter of support. A true collaboration is a relationship among individuals, and it takes time, goodwill, and a lot of listening to develop. And this is especially the case when working with communities that have been repeatedly marginalized and have had their concerns ignored again and again.
For too long, scientists and policymakers have ignored traditional ecological knowledge about Manoomin, and researchers have made little or no attempt to build relationships with tribes. Tribes have repeatedly requested that genetic research on Manoomin, intended to support its large-scale agricultural production, be stopped. As of 2020, a University of Minnesota lab continues to conduct genetic research on Manoomin.
It seems like, the treaty rights, they're supreme law of the land, but the dam pipelines and minings have more rights than our treaty rights.
In efforts to set a Minnesota state water quality standard for Manoomin waters, research was done by others to understand the relationship between water chemistry and Manoomin health. They showed that high sulfate concentration harms Manoomin, but this and other Western biophysical science does not capture the full complexity of Manoomin relationships. Collaboration across ways of knowing between cultures and disciplines is essential.
Manoomin has its story, and it is telling part of that story to different ones of us, because part of the story that you can understand, I can't, and part that I can understand, maybe you don't get, and we're each bringing together the part of the story that Manoomin has shared with us as part of a big picture.
It feels good to be a part of an interdisciplinary project that includes tribal values as part of the interdisciplinary. We've put the tribal needs and tribal goals first. The tribes are leading us in this journey. Manoomin is leading this project.
And our project was given this Ojibwe name, Kawe Gidaa-naanaagadawendaamin Manoomin, to remind everyone on the project of its guiding principles, that first, we must consider Manoomin, or Psiη in Dakota, or wild rice.
One way we are learning from Manoomin is by studying several lakes and rivers of Manoomin significance and concern across present-day Minnesota and Wisconsin, all chosen by our tribal partners. We are looking to understand each lake and river's stories through many different ways, including water chemistry and sediment analysis, and water level monitoring.
Averaged here the abundant sites in blue versus the sparse sites in brown on the right. And so we averaged all the abundant sites and all the sparse sites to see if we could see any trends. We see a potential trend between sites that have higher calcium concentrations and sites that have that are sparse, which have lower calcium concentrations. This is something that's really preliminary, but we do know that calcium is another important macronutrient for plant growth.
Manoomin needs 1 to 3 feet of slow-moving water. It is sensitive to fluctuations in early season water levels where abrupt changes may uproot the plant. From the 2019 field season, we see that abundant Manoomin sites, pictured in this graph in blue, have lower early season water depths than the sparse sites, pictured in brown. This may be a factor in Manoomin abundance, but more monitoring is needed.
The sparse site, which is shown in red, versus the 2 samples we took from the abundant site, which are shown in blue, we see much higher concentrations of organics at the sparse site versus sand and very fine sand at the abundant site. And so we're trying to work through and see what that importance could be as we move forward.
Manoomin's relationships extend beyond individual lakes. They extend across state boundaries and into government offices. We are looking at regional land cover data as well as harvester surveys, and the process of consultation between state and tribal governments around treaty rights.
So here in this image, I've used national land cover data as well as Glyph-WIC wild rice data that was provided to me. Preliminary data is showing actually an inverse relationship between developed land and Manoomin. So basically, there's less rice when there's more development present.
From those conversations and the frustrations felt, there was interest in conducting interviews with both the tribal staff side and the state staff side to understand more about what happened during consultation, what went well, what didn't go well.
How do we move from frustrating consultation to meaningful consultation? A good example of this in a quote is, I think consultation requires listening and certainly at least incorporating some of what's heard in a consultation. Otherwise, it's not meaningful.
As a social scientist on the project, one important outcome for me has been the opportunity to gather different narratives of Manoomin from harvesters, stewards, scientists, students, and policymakers. Manoomin brings us together to reflect not only on our relationships with Manoomin, but also on our relationships with each other.
And the time we're able to spend out all together has really pushed our collaboration a lot farther, and just being out there in the field together has made a really big difference, I think, in how we're all thinking about things and just how we're all able to bring our small pieces of knowledge to put a much bigger picture together.
Coming from a very classically Western trained scientist, this has pushed my boundaries forward a lot in terms of thinking about human interactions. This has really introduced me to a whole new side of science that I never even thought about before, even though I think about human impacts on the environment. I never think of the human side of things, right?
The connections are obvious, and they're things that sort of can't be teased apart, the human side and the kind of natural sciences side. The separation maybe sticks out when we're trying to put things into kind of their traditional silos in the way that we do, you know, all the time as researchers when we're writing a grant proposal or writing a publication or something.
I kind of feel like a lot of those connections come together when people are willing to be together. Necessarily, we break things down a lot of times into what we know and kind of concentrate on those areas. So it might be hard for me to concentrate on some of the chemical aspects of wild rice because I don't know about it, you know? And so the more time I spend with people who do know about it, the more likely we are to influence each other in our thinking.
I think when we look at historical and ongoing issues, I think a lot of us are ingrained in the Western methodologies and theories and practices. Western science is important, but I think that the missing link of that, and I think as we, you know, somehow, you know, change. You know, it's a lot of work to change. We put that spirit back into science. You know, and because that was taken out way back there. You know, and you know, and that there is that ongoing historical trauma, or you know,
should we be necessarily integrating traditional knowledge with Western scientific knowledge? And if we should rather hold them up separately and let them be seen separately. But I've also heard some really compelling cases from people, even within this project, about, you know, interweaving them together, but giving each of them kind of the respect and acknowledgement that they both deserve.
I definitely think early on we were very hesitant to ever talk about integrating knowledges, you know, certainly with all the, you know, connotations of appropriation that become involved there. And I think we only started talking about it at all when, you know, it was some of our tribal partners who kept asking us, you know, and that's even how Melanie came to, you know, do a TEK training with us, because our partners were like, you know, I think you're missing something pretty big here to not be thinking about it.
That I think story is a direct connection, because what is the biophysical story of Manoomin? What is the social story of Manoomin? What is the cultural story of Manoomin? The story is a connection between all of them.
One of the reasons I went into social science was because I wanted to be able to translate what's happening in the environment into a more social perspective that's like politically relevant and all of that. So it feels like that is what we are doing, and I have the opportunity to still be connected to the more biophysical side of the work and not.
Within the efforts of practicing good science and traditional ecological knowledge, there is more to be accomplished. Manoomin is not the only relative that is struggling for survival, but with this start of Gidaa-naanaagadawendaamin Manoomin, there is a new beginning of resilience, sovereignty, and hope for all relatives present to be represented in this same way, just like how we have first considered Manoomin.